In his book, In the Bubble, John Thackara wrote, "We are filling up the world with amazing devices and systems, on top of the natural and human ones that were already here, only to discover that these complex systems seem to be out of control. Too complex to understand, let alone to shape or redirect." He goes on to say, things may seem out of control, but they are not out of our hands. Because if we can design our way into difficulty, we can design our way out. So today, in Norman Potter's manner, we will be hearing 3 pivotal questions. 3 questions that we should ask ourselves and attempt to answer them as often as possible. These questions are: what are we doing? What should we be doing? And lastly, how do we do it? In my opinion, we have the great opportunity to get these answers today, so we can finally begin harnessing our full potential. Today's opportunities are best described in Aldous Huxley's book, Doors of Perception. The man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out. He will be wiser, but less sure, happier, but less self-satisfied, humbler in acknowledging his ignorance, yet better equipped to understand the relationship of words to things. And here we are today. We have all walked through the door. Hopefully, we will leave the room wiser, happier, humbler, and equipped with the potential to design our way out of difficulty. Johna Thackare, the floor is yours.
I'm quite an obedient person, so Barbara said, if you do one thing in Ljubljana, you must go and see the wheel, which I went to see. I discovered a bit later that it's a copy, which was unfortunate, but it's basically the wheel as represented up the hill, which was a fabulous experience. I'm just unbelievably impressed by the way that the old and the new have been combined in this city. So it's one of those situations where you see quality that is unexpected and very deep. But to follow on from that lovely introduction, the story that I took away from the wheel is 3 issues, really. The first thing is that you could argue with some credibility that the creative economy in Slovenia is 3,500 years old, because that was a creative act in response to a need all those years ago. Secondly, that in this culture there is a difference between creating things which are responding to an important question and, on the other hand, things that are created for no obvious reason. We need the wheel, and the whole of civilization has benefited from that. But thirdly, that just by way of kind of an introduction, that there is a kind of continuity in terms of responding to the realities of the situation rather than dreaming about utopian futures. The history of your country is so extraordinarily rich and tiring to read, all these cultures and languages coming and going, so the space for kind of idle dreaming that you have in other cultures which have had an easier time is in some interesting way removed. But just in the last 2 or 3 days, walking around the city and being shown places by my wonderful hosts, there are certain signs of, I think, hope for the future, which is not me being polite, I promise you. For example, the way that this piece of stone has been fashioned as the kind of holder for the wire railings. That's an old and new materials, but this is somebody who loves stone, and I am a stone lover myself. I come from a part of France where people are obsessed by stones. I think if you respect stone, that's pretty much a big part of the hope for the future. The way that the different volumes and spaces and materials are combined in a heritage site, it was absolutely remarkably well done. I mean, I travel a lot, and it's really a very, very world-class combination of physical introduction. This is the nicest farm market cart I've seen anywhere in my whole life. I have no idea what the kind of history of that is, but I'm a complete fanatic about street markets and farmers markets and the general equipment that is available to connect citizens to the supplies of their food. So you have that already, so to speak, in the bag. The food itself is and looks fantastic. The question that I was left with in my visits to the food market is that it looks fantastic, but I have no idea where it comes from or what its story is. So that's one of the things I'm going to talk about in the next 50 minutes or so, is that you have positive assets, love of stone, historical kind of realism and so on, but all sorts of things that can be added to change the kind of way that the city exploits existing assets. Terrific street furniture for the stall holders. And I think my favorite artifact in the whole of my visit so far, the mleko mat, which is perhaps not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but I haven't personally encountered something before, and not just the milk, but there's one next to it selling organic cheese, and there's somewhere else which I did not find where you can get honey. Now, I think that human beings are better than mleko mats, but the beauty of this machine is that if it's empty, you can press a button and the farmer will speak to you. As my friend told me, that I'm in a truck driving down, I'll be there in 15 minutes. So all over the world, people are saying we have to reconnect city people to the sources of their food. Here in the mleko mat, you have that kind of connection. It needs, perhaps you could argue it needs a bit more improvement in terms of what it looks like and sounds like, but basically you have that as a starting point. So what I want to do is talk about three things. Firstly, you may want, and you certainly deserve, an explanation of this concept of this word BioCity. What does it mean? And in what ways does it connect to the realities of the city of Ljubljana? Secondly, what kind of the contents of a city, and I'm going to introduce the only buzzword I hope of today is this notion of the social ecological system. The whole of my story today basically is about people, how they're living in cities connect with and interact with the living systems upon which we all depend. And then I'll finish up with some design actions and some thoughts on what the design world can do to help the city evolve to take advantage of this, I think, amazing opportunity. And after my very short visit so far, it's really a very exciting potential. But my first question is, why do we have to think about some word like BioCity or bioregion? The tree on the left is called the Jequitiba tree. It's in one of the tallest trees in the world. It's from Brazil. And what's remarkable about it is that every day it takes 40 to 50 metric tons of water from the earth up into the sky, and without the use of pumps, electric motors, architects, municipal authorities, electricity or money, it just has a symbiotic relationship with its environment and becomes a remarkable structure. Whereas on the left is a typical modern building. This is the Comcast building. It's the headquarters of one of the world's biggest media companies. Quite new, LEED certified for those amongst you who are architects, which is to say it's the greenest skyscraper in America. But this is where we encounter the misuse or the frankly laughable concept of something being green when you have an artifact which has the effect of sucking the life out of not just the power system but the cultures on a very large distance. And to compare the Jequitiba tree, it doesn't go backwards, okay, to where we are now, I want to introduce you to a kind of a historical comparison. So the man on the right is a typical inhabitant of the Comcast building. I'm actually jumping to London at this point. I don't know if you saw these pictures in the newspaper some time ago when a man climbed to the top of the Shard, which is the tallest building in Europe, recently opened in London, designed by Renzo Piano. And he took these pictures, and the pictures show brave, daring hipster climbing to the top of a building in the middle of the night, takes pictures. But I thought the picture was fascinating because of the lovely twinkling lights of London behind him, which looked so kind of decorative and impressive. Whereas on the other side is a picture of a hunter-gatherer, somebody who lived on and with the land 10,000 and more years ago. And the main comparison is between the amount of energy and calories that they needed in order to be where they are in those two images. So on the left you see that the hunter-gatherer in a day moving around, food, maybe a bit of shelter, maybe something to keep them warm, would use 5,000 calories of energy interpreted in different ways per day. Whereas Mr. Hipster on top of the shard, on the right, same human being, body pretty much identical, our bodies haven't changed so much over those years, 60,000 calories per day, once not just his food and his clothing and his shelter, but all the kind of stuff behind him is included in. So that's a difference between the primitive and the modern of 60 times. 60 times more resources to keep Mr. Hipster alive than Mr. Hunter-Gatherer. And the basic story of cities for the last thousands of years has been that cities use more and more resources per person living in them, but these resources do not come out of thin air, they come from somewhere else. That's what cities do. They're like pumps sucking in money, people, energy, water, food. That's what cities do, and that's why people go there. But what's happening now is that we've had this kind of slow realization that the resources and the energy and the general kind of requirements of cities are out of proportion to what is possible in the long run to sustain. But we're then getting a most terrible shift in which the city says, okay, we will move from burning oil to light up the skyscrapers. We will move from burning coal, maybe we'll move from burning nuclear. We will get our energy from biofuel. And this is happening right now in Europe and in other parts of the world. That in the UK, for example, the biggest power station, Drax, has converted itself to biofuel, only for it to be discovered that 90% of the wood that will be burned in this power station will be imported from outside the UK. And for this wood to be obtained, 90%, it will have to come from the destruction of old growth forests in places like Indonesia or southern states of America. So in other words, this clean biofuel to keep this lovely city moving along is going to directly make the situation of biodiversity worse that we've all been becoming more anxious about in the past. So if you imagine the kind of power stations, certainly of the UK and US, converting to wood, which they can only obtain by eucalyptus plantations that replace old forests. And yesterday or 2 days ago, China Airlines said, oh, we can now fly around the Pacific using biofuel from palm plantations. If you convert the major power stations plus the airline fleet to this biofuel, that will guarantee the destruction of all the forests in the world in rather quick time, not very long, a decade at the most. Because we are separated in our kind of behavior, our economy and our minds from the source of the energy that creates the modern world. So this is where we are, and I'm not going to go on about the crisis. We know there's a crisis. But the thing we don't properly connect is that we know there's a financial crisis, we know there's economic disruption, but the biggest crisis of all is the fact that we are mentally and psychologically and culturally separated from the biological basis of the world that keeps us alive. We have no direct knowledge, we don't think about where the wood will come to light our buildings or to do all of that. It's just happening. Except that I think that all over the world, and I'm sure many of you in the same spirit, you sense that a shift is growing in power from this notion of let's not think about all this to an awareness that we used to have very naturally. The hunter-gatherer would naturally understand his or her dependency on living systems. We spent a few thousand years separated from that. Now we're reconnecting. And one of the beautiful phrases of Thomas Berry, who's one of the great writers about this kind of blind spot in our collective minds, he calls it the ecozoic era that we're coming into, the reintegration of all our endeavors into a larger ecological consciousness. I think it's happening. I can't show you evidence, but everywhere I go you get the sense that people are saying we cannot go on like this. That is one part of this very profound shift. And one of the things that happens once we start to internalize that it's not just about human beings, it's about all of life, then all our priorities change in terms of business, policy, design, urbanism. If you start to ask the question at the beginning, like, by the way, what are the consequences of my proposed action for all living systems, then our priorities will very radically change. So for the last 400 or 500 years, the notion of human-centered design, human-centered activities, everything being for people, was regarded as a progressive thing. Not any longer. It's not enough to do things that are good for all people if, by doing that, you destroy the living systems upon which we all depend. It's not a small change, but that is what is happening. The well-being of all of life is the reference point to the decisions that we make about what to do. This is moving from an economy in which we dig things up out of the ground or chop them down in one part of the world and then burn them or consume them somewhere else. That is the model for the last 200 years. The new model is all the things that we do have to make the soil, the water, the forests, the land better than when we started. Regeneration, not just doing less bad, but improving the situation. Moving from an economy which consumes gigantic amounts of resources, this is the chart from another point of view, to one in which we use time to create value, time to make things healthier, time for the soil to recover, time for the water to get cleaner, and so on. So from one model of, which is most of our economies have had this notion of either trade or imperial theft over the years. And this notion, which you know pretty extremely everywhere, we have the same problem of an economy in which there's no prospect of work or jobs or insecurity is extreme because we are not in control of the economic activities that create us the possibilities for security. So on the left there is a picture of the typical European city economy at the moment, in which the participation of global companies, for example, global tour companies. These groups of Chinese and Japanese tourists, I would be surprised if more than 20% of the money that they spend stays in this city. You could correct me. But basically, for food, for travel, for hotel chains, for computers, for big technology, everything is global companies that when you or I spend money in Ljubljana, maybe 20% stays here if you're lucky, probably less. The other 80% goes, well, it goes somewhere else. So local security in a kind of region or a country is in conflict with the logic of the businesses, which is to take the value away. And it's a kind of just also a cultural shift. It's this notion throughout the kind of modern era in which man is on top, man is in control. We have the right to do what we want with natural resources. That was then the dominion theory of mastery, to the notion that we are coexisting with the living systems upon which we are completely codependent, and it's the metaphor of stewarding and looking after things rather than controlling them and exploiting them. So, that's the big picture. We can argue at the end of my talk about whether you agree with that analysis. This is my totally unscientific, but I travel a lot, what I hear people saying, what I feel is happening in the world in many different cultures. So what is a bioregion? Supposing that the notion of economy, the notion of livelihood, the notion of well-being is moving from something based on money or consuming things or physical possessions to the health of the living systems, how does that connect to what a city is, or a region, or a country? It's actually not a totally new idea. So one of the utterly neglected pioneers, Mr. Udvari from Hungary, in the 1970s, was one of the early geographers who said, why do we divide the world up on maps into countries with straight lines or very strange borders between administrative or political entities? Why do we do that when actually the world makes more sense if you look at river systems, mountains, types of soil, and so on? So there is a prehistory of people who mapped the biogeographies of the world at different scales, and it's done with quite a lot of scientific precision, but totally without any kind of resonance or impact on the way that the world is organized, because I would be surprised if you've heard of Mr. Udvari or the whole subject very much before. It's been rather systematically avoided until now. The exception is that in those parts of the world where people are most kind of militant about reconnecting with natural systems rather than political ones or economic ones, this is in the northwest of the United States, which, as you know, Portland, Seattle, very, very kind of green, progressive, the kind of high-tech, high ecology sort of capital of the world in some respects, certainly in the industrial world. There's a somewhat advanced kind of movement to rename their region Cascadia rather than the Pacific Northwest, which is what it's called in politics at the moment. And Cascadia has a flag, a kind of governance, it has an education program. You can go and study it in the universities, the kind of Pacific Northwest, bioregional, etc., etc. I don't want to exaggerate how advanced it is, but it's to say that there are probably 10 or 20 regions around the world where people are taking it quite seriously and saying we need a new geography as well as a new mental map of our position in order to make sense of this shift from the artificial to the natural. In France, 2 years ago, there was a kind of interesting, only in France, I live in France and I love it dearly, but France has its own ways. They took this kind of transition as a cultural phenomenon and created this gigantic exhibition called the Fertile City, La Vie Fertile. Quite enormous, very bizarrely not given much coverage. I was lucky enough to go to it. And there whereas the French kind of architectural world and the urbanists, and it was Mr. Sarkozy, who was then president, sort of was the sponsor of this show. He said, we need to rethink the metropolis in the age of environmental limits. And so the result in France was this enormous exhibition in which basically very rich Parisians went around sitting on parks having picnics. I'm exaggerating. But this is where you have a picturesque, kind of romantic view of the BioCity, is something where you literally stand and look at it as a glorious spectacle, which I think is perhaps missing the point about the realities that I'm going to talk about. What is happening in a more pragmatic way on the ground of cities all over the world, increasingly, and some of you may be involved in this, is finding ways to reduce the separation of urban space from natural space, the concept of the bio-corridor, restoring rivers, looking at ways that trees and watersheds can be reconnected to the city, not in a literal going backwards sense, but kind of in a kind of more interesting combination. There's a very fascinating project in Seattle called Pollinator Pathway, where an artist, kind of botanist, has planted gardens right across the city to be the home for bees and butterflies and pollinating insects. So proactively, as a design action, kind of like a chessboard, introducing bits of wild vegetation so that the passage of the bees and the pollinating insects can go through the city and not, so to speak, die when they reach the city limits. And there's a whole variety of systems, like in Chicago, they have a very big program to re-engineer their streets and to use the street system as ways of processing water and so on. We could talk about that if you like. Don't try and read these words. I'm just putting up there as a sign that there's a huge amount of different interpretations about what the word bioregion could or might mean. And I don't expect it's not even in your language, but there's a lot of disagreement. So I have one opinion. Actually, I have a kind of frame around a multiplicity of things. It's just to give you an idea that there is a lot of activity, but for the most part, scientists, geographers, ecologists, not very much in the kind of urban planning mainstream, not very much yet in the economic development mainstream, but it's just about to explode. You can sense that anywhere. So rather than look at all those words, the way I would like us to think about the bioregion is as a form of geography in which two forms of energy coexist rather than fight each other. That is to say, the natural energy of living plants and systems and water, and the capacity of that tree I showed you at the beginning to feed itself from the land without any external inputs. That is the kind of natural system. And the second system is the social system, in which people, in order to meet their needs for food and shelter, whatever, are incredibly creative in lots of different situations, for the most part not considering themselves to be members of the creative class or designers, but just being innovative in order to find new ways to meet their needs. So this is the social economy, sometimes called the solidarity economy. Those two can and do interact with each other, but I think the tasks of a bioregion in terms of development is to say, we're not starting from zero. All this is happening out there somewhere. What can we do as policy, as urban design, as design, to accelerate, enhance, and improve the ways that these are going on? And I will show you some examples. In other words, combining natural energy and social energy in ways that are not the same as the very resource-intensive cities we've had up until now. And so this word social ecological system is very important that you don't take away from, for me it's important, that it's not about going into the forest and living with wild animals. I mean, some people can do that, they do that now. It's about, we have built all these cities. It's a big problem. I don't think it's a very good idea that half the population lives in cities, but it's just a fact. The cities is what we have. They will evolve whatever we do. So therefore, when we think about the social and the ecological, it's not just in green fields, it's discovering and reconnecting the ecological in the urban situation. So like here in India, it's not a kind of back to the forest or back to the land. And it's the two things we need to know is, one, it's very complicated, and secondly, it's already happening. It's not something that we need to create happening. But as I said, let me give you some examples of where the social and the ecological interact already, just normal daily life. So these are just words, and I'll show you a few examples of where these two forms of energy systems connect with each other. Food is an obvious example. I saw this beautiful illustration about the industrial food system and the agroecological, and you probably, no, you can't read the details, but on the left is the future of radically smaller scale, fewer inputs of energy and resources. This agroecological, it's a big sort of umbrella over a whole variety of different ways of growing food in a more healthy way, to put it simply. And on the right is the system that has been growing for the last 2 generations since the Green Revolution, the industrial system. The main thing to kind of see, which you can read, is that if I go into a supermarket, here or anywhere else in the world really, and spend $10 on food, or 10 euros, in round numbers, the farmer who did the work on the soil to grow that food will get 60 cents. So I spend $10, the farmer gets 60 cents. So between the farmer and me are all sorts of activities that mean 2 things. They generate changes to the food as it comes out of the ground. They create profits for the companies that do that. And they reduce, by the way, of course, as you know, the health value of the food. So therefore you have a system which is resource intensive and unhealthy and undesirable in lots of ways, but is also very unfair. So the social and the ecological in food is at its most extreme. And the things that are happening now about Western companies buying land in Africa and South Asia to grow food for us rich people in Europe and America. It's just a terrible crime, but it's the logical consequence of having a model of food growing like the one on the right. So agroecology means helping the farmers on the left of that picture connect more directly with hungry people in the cities and outside them in ways in which the sharing of the exchange is much more equitable. And all over the world there are just thousands upon thousands of experiments in which people are saying we have to change the relationship between the person who grows food and the person who eats it. This is in Lapland. I was a couple of months ago, where, just as a totally random example, this woman has a family that has a small farmer of 20 hectares growing wheat in this, in my opinion, rather hostile environment, but very beautiful. She has opened a shop selling the flour and the wheat directly to the citizens of Rovaniemi, so that the connection between the growing and the buying and the eating is reduced from 10 steps to 2 or 3 steps. The farmer gets more money per kilo of grain, the citizen of Rovaniemi gets much higher quality grain, and so that's part of the system is improved. But this requires the ecological aspect of organic farming in that particular place, and the social innovation of changing the distribution of the way that the things move through the system when they leave the field. So that's just flour in Lapland. Multiply that over everything that one would conceivably eat or drink, and you can see that there's a gigantic amount of work to be done in reorganizing the relations between food and citizens in lots of different ways, and that's what a social ecological system means. It's nothing more complicated than that. And all over the world, you see people connecting very unlikely groups of people in this enterprise. This is Will Allen, who's an incredibly charismatic person in Philadelphia and Baltimore, who works with very challenged young people in urban situations to begin with composting centers and very simple urban farms. Now he's got 20 of these facilities with hundreds of people working on growing food in cities, helping to distribute directly to their community, filling in food deserts and so on. He is not to consider himself to be creative, a designer, an urban developer, or any of these words. He's just an amazing guy who was a sportsman, who said it's ridiculous that we should have to buy bad quality food from a supermarket when we can grow our own. We have all these unemployed young people who need meaningful work. So that's the social and the ecological combining, not spontaneously, because he's done 20 years of very hard work to get this started, but that's where you have something from the grassroots coming up that we can see as the seed of something bigger. Food markets, excuse me, I'm just checking my timer. Where these systems of food come together are in the market that I told you at the beginning when I went to the absolutely amazing food market here in Ljubljana, but I was completely mystified. I didn't know what I was looking at or who I was meeting, because it was all sitting there looking beautiful, but I said, well, it could come from the moon for all I know. So there's a whole kind of movement called telling the story of the food, telling the story of the farmer, connecting people to each other that have not previously met, which is, in my opinion, a kind of design activity. So this is the new Amsterdam market in New York, which is a kind of rather rich part of the world, but they have an incredible variety of connections being made. And this market is what began life as a normal place where somebody comes along and says, I've got 100 kilos of courgette to sell, who will pay me for them? Now they have a curator of the market, like in a museum or an art gallery. The market is curated as an experience in which different kinds of people come every period to make a presentation, everything from making rye bread to how to grow melons using water, whatever. It's like a university or a food system university in the open air. There's more knowledge exchanged in the New Amsterdam market than every university in North America, in my somewhat biased opinion. That's where you find out more about refashioning, reconnecting the food system. And it goes through to the cafes and the restaurants and the people. Like, this city is extraordinary. There are more cafes than people here, but somehow or another, the next step is to have the cafes and the kind of public-facing enterprises part of this storytelling environment. So in Rovaniemi, which is this picture, I'm back to Lapland, if I ask that woman where the fish comes from or where the bread comes from, she will A, have met and worked with the fisherman and the bread maker and the grower of the wheat, but she will also have a big story about the quality and the story about it. So the helping each other understand and connect is not limited to kind of teachers, but everybody in the system is part of a collaborative, shared endeavor. Fibre sheds, clothing. Now, we all know about sustainable or unsustainable the clothing business is. This is a very complicated story, but just to say that there do exist people in the world who are saying, if we can organize a food shed, tell stories about the food that comes from a region, connect people, make visible the processes, make kind of fair the exchanges, why can we not do the same thing for fibre, which at the end of the day also grows in the ground? So in various parts of the world, in Egypt, in America, in Australia, people are beginning to make a fibre shed model in which they grow things that, like hemp or whatever, bamboo, that are fibre yielding plants that naturally flourish in their region, and then they make very explicit all the different steps that are made to turn a plant into a dress or a jacket, and that therefore everybody is, so to speak, part of a story that has a kind of coherence. You can see the whole thing in one picture, and it's not that you then replace the global textile system with fibre sheds, but you provide that as the basis of an alternative way. So if you want to know where your clothes come from, in theory you can go to the field and meet the person who grew the plant. In Holland there's a woman called Christine Mandaertsma who does this with flax. Absolutely genius project in which the farmers and the people who make the hemp and the weavers and the dyers and all these people are part of an ecosystem. They all talk to each other, and the people who buy her textiles and her clothes can meet the different people or go to the website and see that story. Now, I have not had, I don't know how the kind of the bioregion of this part of Europe is for growing fibres, but I just know that somebody out there for sure, in the design world or in the fashion world or in the textile world, will know about things that are unique to this region or plants that can provide commodity textiles. So every region where things grow at all has the potential to be a fibre shed. Not always productive in the same way that the kind of industrial production of fibre. But all over the world, people are saying, okay, what do we have by way of resources that can get us started? So there's bound to be herbs or lichen or minerals that can be used for dyeing. And just to show you an example of where this is from Iceland. In Iceland, if anybody's been to Iceland, they have the most amazing lichen growing on the rocks, the kind of micro plants that have extraordinary qualities as dyes for textiles, only found in Iceland, so they're rare and beautiful. And so some of the small farmers of Iceland who've had a whole series of disasters to deal with, not as many as Slovenia, I accept, but they've had a very tough 10 years, not as tough as your 2,000 years. They have started to say, how do we connect the interest in natural dyes with the kind of things that grow naturally around our island? Can we, for example, grow using thermal energy some of the kind of plants that yield these extraordinary qualities? Well, they're doing this experiment. So if they can do it in Iceland, I would be surprised if you cannot do something similar here. Another place where social meets ecological is the distribution of water. I showed you, the blue, by the way, in the background is the kind of capillarity of plants kind of on a bigger scale. The way that trees and plants take water from the ground into their leaves is powerful is a miracle. Just in the last 5 years, I suppose, cities have begun to be explained to themselves how terribly insecure their water situation is. You know about that. I don't know what it's like here, but in most places, even when it appears to be raining a lot, the sheer overconsumption of water by industrial life has meant that cities are having to get serious about it. There comes into the world the concept of capturing water where it falls, rather than, as for the last 200 years, pumping it somewhere else. And all over the world, people are doing experiments on how do we capture the rain in ways that are functionally effective, but also are pleasing and artistically interesting. So this is in Austria, this is in France, this is in Australia, where architects have said, okay, we have to stop wasting water. Where do we put the water? At the moment, we have these clunky, great big barrels that are either a health hazard or an aesthetic hazard or both. A woman called Sally has made this kind of flat pack water tank that you can cover a house, put underneath it or all over it. Once they are filled up with rain, they can supply a family for, for months. It's just a very practical example of how something like very ecological called rainwater capture does generate the opportunities for somebody to design something useful. For those of you who are still wondering whether all of this has any connection to your lives as designers, Sally is an architect. She's now become a product developer designing rainwater capture tanks. Quite a successful business, and not something that she set out to do, but once she started to change her reference about her task as an architect, this is what came out of it. But here I want to introduce this notion of infrastructure, or green infrastructure, because all over the world, as you know, governments are saying, well, we have to kick-start the economy. Mr. Obama says, we need to build lots of roads and bridges. Mr. Cameron in England wants to build a ridiculous high-speed train, which has no particular need, but is in their minds, very heavy infrastructure is the same thing as economic development. Which in kind of certain respects, it is true that large amounts of money are spent on these infrastructures. They employ a certain number of people, consultants and engineers, for a certain amount of time. But any critical look at the relationship between the resource required for a road or a high-speed train or large infrastructure projects relative to the health and the well-being of the community, never mind the health and well-being of living systems, it just doesn't make sense. However, since people like me can say that, we have to say to the politicians and the policymakers and the regional governments, okay, if you can't start your economy by building roads or trains or airports, what are the alternatives? And that is where, when you think of the social and the ecological, the service-intensive infrastructure as things that people do, or things that plants do, or things that rivers do, rather than concrete things or electromechanical things, service-intensive infrastructure is something which, as a matter of fact, generates a huge amount of work, but it also costs probably 10% or 1% of the equivalent old-fashioned heavy infrastructure. Which is my excuse for introducing one of my heroes from America, Lisa Schipek. She's an infrastructure maker. She started an organization called Watershed Management Group 7 years ago now in Tucson, Arizona, which is one of the places in the United States where they simultaneously have a terrible economic crisis and a water crisis now, not in the future. And she in her street in Tucson said, I don't want to, if we wait for the city or for the regional government or the state government to retrofit new forms of rainwater capture, we will be waiting a long time. It ain't going to happen. So she got together with some friends and they created a work gang, like something you'd see in a prison film, to physically dig holes in their neighborhood that have, like swales, I have no idea what that word would be in Slovenian, a hole in the ground where the rain goes into the earth rather than goes into the sewage system. And they started on one street, then they did the next street, and they then graduated to, from doing the streets outside their houses to, I'm going to find the picture, to doing the tanks to put the water in that falls onto the roofs of the houses. So street by street, house by house. For the first 2 years, 100% voluntary labour. That's why this notion of sweat equity, or just the physical work of people, not because they were kind of green fanatics, but because they knew they were going to be driven out of their homes by a lack of water unless they did something physical to change the way that their city is organised. That initial social movement, it's a social innovation of people saying we have to voluntarily get ourselves together and change the water behaviour of our city, has now spanned a whole different series of programmes of training. You can get a certificate in watershed management, you can become a work gang leader, and after 5 or 6 years, what happened was that these volunteers started to meet with the city halls and saying, oh, this is fantastic, by the way, can we the city help you do this in any better way? And there were a whole variety of ways to do with regulations or whatever that was aggravating. So now, 8 years down the line, the Watershed Management Group still has 80% volunteer labour doing this activity, but it's in collaboration with the planning departments, the city departments, and the sort of utility companies, because they've understood a shared interest in getting work done in this totally new way, without which it would not have been done at all. And you can get a certificate, as I said. So they start, I'm not suggesting that this will create millions of jobs, but these for me are real green jobs and not the fake green jobs of, for example, growing oil plantations to put into aeroplane engines. This is a nice one from, remember I showed you Cascadia in Portland, Oregon, where the notion of the city as something which is like alien to natural forces, people who started out as kind of activists and people who in the middle of the night would dig holes in the ground so that the water from the air would go into the earth, has now become official part of Portland, Oregon urban planning policy. So you can actually get a certificate of permission from the city on a website to dig a hole in the tarmac or the concrete, and their target is to reduce by 20% over 5 years the paved surface of the city, so that the kind of porosity of the city and its kind of connection to the earth is, the kind of gap between the hard and the soft is removed by individuals like that doing that work. And they've got a whole series of different business models, paid jobs, unpaid jobs. And then this is from Wales, where they have again a totally different variety of, they have all these hills like you do here, and on the steepest hills, even the sheep don't go, or that they're not encouraged to go. There's a lot of plant life which has potential as an essence, heavily distilled. So in the University of Bangor, they have a group that is designing these very high-tech machines that can take a pile of herbs and turn them into a kind of small volume of valuable essence of something. And they don't yet know how to make a business about it, but it's just one of the examples of where the technology story at the service of life, rather than other things, is beginning to be made. So this is the first 2 parts of my story. Oh, good, I'm doing 10 more minutes. So, this is, I know it's a big story, you're being very patient, just to say that these array of thousands of different, for the most part, small experiments in the ways that cities reconnect with their bioregion, in which the kind of possibility for work and livelihood, I'm not saying jobs, but the possibility for economically meaningful activity are beginning to be rediscovered. It does still leave unanswered the question, if you're a designer or an architect or a planner or a development specialist, what can one do to accelerate the emergence of the bioregion as the new geography of our futures? So I'm going to talk about 4 things in the last few minutes. One is the concept of talent spotting. Secondly, I'm going to talk about technology because I have a brilliant, if strange slide to answer what Tina asked me. What has all this got to do with technology? Because we need to have an answer to the question, in economic terms, where does technology fit into a bioregion? Thirdly, how to think about it. Then finally, kind of a little conclusion about the fact that I don't have the answers, but we need to meet in better ways to look for them.
So the notion of talent spotting, you know, in the music business, they have people who call A&R scouts, audience research, who go around dingy pubs looking for some brilliant band or singer that has been not discovered, and they get them and take them into the music business. Or the same in the sport world, people who go and find a young boy or girl playing something in a school who's got fantastic promise but is not yet, so to speak, in the system. The same can apply to social and ecological innovation. People doing things with remarkable potential who for the most part don't know that what they're doing is special. That is true for most of what I'm talking about, that people do things because they feel the urge. I think there's a whole world of activity that designers and artists can do called getting out there and looking to see the interesting experiments that people are doing and say, by the way, this is amazing what you're doing, would you like some help? I don't want to say too much more than about it than that, but the opportunities that are out there to rethink the potential of the city, the kind of dead spaces or abandoned plots all over the cities of the world after the last 5 or 6 years. Every city contains bits of land that for developers are either too small to be interesting or too expensive or they're just complicated. But for people growing food or fibers or wheat or whatever, small bits of land have enormous potential. How can one then make those visible to the community as a whole? And it's not just about maps, it's also about when you have a map, what do you do with it? Because this is a project from the northeast of England in a town called Middlesbrough, which is a classic kind of old industrial small city where all the industries have gone. They had 40% unemployment. But by doing the exercise in 2 phases called making a map of the spaces physically in the city, either empty buildings or empty land, where you could put activities or grow things or do stuff, then the city created an event where all the citizens came together and said, what possible range of things could we do with this building, this field, this hole in our city? And out of that came a whole series of different activities, some good, some bad. The point being, it wasn't some expert in City Hall saying, you can have that and you can have that. It was a kind of collective, creative exercise in which a variety of very unexpected possibilities came out. And the important thing is to make these opportunities visible to the city at large, or to the region at large, not have some kind of report or a slideshow or some very thing. You need to make events, and I'm going to finish on this as well, in which people who are doing projects can meet each other, and the citizens can meet the project people, and the policymakers and the people running the place can meet each other, and so on. It's something which you think, and is obvious, but it's so unusual for it to happen. This is a project in France where in Saint-Étienne, just by happy coincidence, there was a large space and the city was willing to say, the regional government said, what have we got happening in our region? Is there anything happening here? And our little team said, well, let's look. We spent 6 months doing our kind of reconnoiter, our sort of talent spotting. In 6 months, we identified 46 projects. Everything from some mad person growing mushrooms, a fanatic who makes tea out of wild plants, a man who has a business with donkeys, as a kind of courier service with donkeys, something to do with growing fish in an old mine shaft, whatever. 46 amazing and very strange projects. And they all came together for 2 weeks, and that's what you're looking at there. And the beautiful thing about that experience was that it wasn't just the kind of the public coming to say, this is fantastic, and then going home to watch the television, but all sorts of connections were made between the citizens of that region and the projects, which spawned and stimulated lots of new activity. So it's to do with this concept of breathing the same air. I'm a very powerful advocate of not relying on media or films or documents. You have to get people together in the same space to breathe the same air, and that's when magic happens. And I promised you, and I promised Tina anyway, what has this got to do with technology, since everybody put so much into it? Now this is the single most unpleasant to look at slide of today, but I'm rather pleased with it because somebody said yesterday, well, is there an app for a bioregion? Can you kind of put all this stuff on a phone? And I was thinking last night about, well, no, it's an obvious example, But the big problem in these discussions is you have the technology world does the technology thing over here, and the green people do the green thing over here, and there's very little contact between them, so it's assumed very falsely that it's a choice. Either we go the technology road, or we go the green road, which in most people's minds is going back to nature, no power, no heat, no whatever, exaggerating. And this, of course, is a false choice, and that's why with my story, my answer to the question is that it's not either technology, yes or no, it's saying we need a filter. So under what circumstances is technology going to be useful in this bioregional strategy? And when is it a diversion, when we should something else? So I have decided that the whole subject of technology, which is, say, communication technology, networks, iPhones, and apps, are perfect for all that huge cloud of activities called the sharing economy. And the three examples I will give you, there's probably, I could easily come up with 100. If you want a pizza, you come to Ljubljana, you want a pizza, it's very reasonable that an app, a technology platform should say, here is the location of the best pizza, and here is why everybody thinks it's the best pizza. That's okay. That is something which is a technology providing an answer to a need. If you then, perhaps as a result of eating too many pizzas, have a heart attack and fall down on the streets of Ljubljana, it is a very desirable thing that you can find somebody to do defibrillation instantly before you become a corpse. This is a very reasonable need, which is one of the projects you read about in the book, I think. Why not have a system which connects citizens with defibrillators to come and get you before the ambulance whose way is blocked by tourists eating ice cream? That is a very good idea. And then you're lying there and you wake up and there's some lorry driver defibrillating, you think, oh my God, I need to get to a hospital. That is a good moment in which you want to ride share, press a button, and a car will come and take you to the hospital before the guy with the truck driver with the defibrillators finishes you off for good. Those are very reasonable ways to share resources, access things when you need them, fast, targeted, using existing resources. And there's 1,001 sharing economy things out there, as you know. There are other things for which technology is simply not going to be a useful answer. And that is where I think time, trust, and attention are part of the picture. Things that require time and your presence without necessarily doing very much are activities where technology is either a diversion or doesn't help very much. Dementia. There is no app to cure dementia. There is no medical science to cure dementia, as a matter of fact. There is a need for social support for people and families somebody who has become unwell. And there are lots and lots of interesting ways in which one can increase this amount of social support for a family in which somebody has dementia. None of those things, for the most part, are a technology solution. There are a lot of people looking for technology solutions, but that is not where the real important progress is to be made. The restoration of the soil, which has been damaged by industrial activities, there is no app for that. You cannot artificially make soil healthy. It takes time, and you can do a bit of kind of cleaning, but in general, it requires years and years of putting fibrous living matter back into the soil for the soil to recover. There is no app for that. That is time and work and patience and attention. And I showed you earlier the kind of people who love rocks. You can't there is no app for building a stone wall. You can, a bit of technology. But if you see where I'm going, there are two kinds of activity that both take us towards a kind of inhabiting a bioregion in a way which is mindful and productive. Some things which will be easier with technology and some not. So we must not have an artificial choice. This is just two examples. So there's an app in England called Land Share, which is a website where if you're living in a city, you would like to grow your food, but you don't have any garden. And then somewhere else in the city is somebody, maybe a retired person or somebody whose children have left home, who has a garden but doesn't want to grow food. This website connects the growing person and the garden person together. 85,000 conjunctions have been made in the last 18 months. That's a brilliant example of sort of an app which uses technology to connect people who need to do things or to share resources. Whereas the people, my friends in the Cevennes in France, who are rebuilding 136,000 kilometers of terraced walls, there's no way that anything except with their hands can do that. Apps can't do that. But people get so much pleasure out of it, it's one of the mysteries of, and that's a time-based value. So I think I've got my story about that. How do we think as a bioregion? One example of where, in a very formal economic development terms, it's happening. This is in Germany. It's a project called ALUO, and it's somewhere in the kind of North Rhine-Westphalia. There's rivers, there's fields. The main thing is that they have a lot of industrial development, which is in trouble, even in Germany, because of the crisis. And they're saying, how do we rethink the way that we occupy this part of Germany? And they have this incredible biodiversity and natural resources, but they have tremendous pressure also from people who want to build hotels, water sports, whatever, industrial facilities. And for the first time, pretty much in the world, that group of politicians and business people and activists and eco-people said, let us not just start fighting immediately, let us get around a table and say, what are the range of possibilities that we can find or imagine for our bioregion? They then created a set of communication tools, which I don't know whether you can see those, but this is a kind of design, where design contributes, traditional design schools, information design, all the different functions that could be imagined to take place in that bioregion. Growing corn, cleaning water, growing trees, burying dead bodies. It's extraordinary, everything. It's German, they're very thorough. Lots of process ideas. They were, so to speak, not just put onto the table, they were put into a multi-dimensional space called the ALUO bioregional map, which became an artifact used by all these different people to say, well, okay, if we build a dam to farm fish here, the consequences will be good or bad somewhere else in the bioregion. For the first time, two things. They looked at all the dimensions about economic proposals before they did them, rather than doing it hoping for the best. But secondly, they created, as an explicit design task, a kind of a visual way for them all to see if they were talking about the same thing. Because the big problem, as you must know, is that we all imagine we're communicating clearly, but often are not. So ALUO, some people from Graz University were the leaders of this. A friend of mine called Klaus Lunhardt, and he's an architect, by the way, and he has landscape architects, ecologists, scientists, information designers, economists, a couple of MBAs. The team is very fundamentally the different skills you find in any economic ecosystem, and they use this to say, by the way, we agree about nothing except one thing. We want our bioregion to be healthier in the future than it is today. How we achieve that, they don't yet know, but they've said we will not just go running around doing our own thing. We will collectively establish a kind of form of activity that enables us to think clearly about how to make the wisest choices. And so to conclude, so imagine that you have a kind of representation of the bioregion. You have all the different people who are involved, the project leaders, the activists, the scientists, the politicians. How can we help them communicate better in order for this bioregional future to unfold? And it comes back to one of my many heroes, Martin Buber. All real living is meeting, a great theologian and philosopher. I know that I saw somewhere one of your brochures about Ljubljana, city of meetings. There's quite a few in the world. Den Bosch in Holland is a city of meetings. I used to think that was a very sad thing to be a city of meetings, because too many of the meetings that one has been to are very formal, joyless experiences. But that's exactly the point. We cannot stop meeting. What we can do is to meet in a better designed way. So insofar as it's not for designers or any of the individual specialist skills in this room to be responsible for bioregions, But between us, and including with design skills, we can design our meetings to be better experiences so that all these different people can find a way to wisely reflect on what the next steps should be. This is in Venice. I have a whole story about Venice, which I'm not going to tell you. The point being that all throughout the last hour, I've told you about the fact that a bioregion is a human system and a natural system, and it's the ways that they interact. It's not like a pyramid or a train with things that neatly going one in front of another. It's all sorts of people with different interests, different ideas, different expectations. We cannot just wish that they would go away. We have to accept the reality that that is what a bioregion contains. This is a food ecosystem. The point being, how do we enable everybody from a cook to a restaurateur to a farmer to somebody running a refrigeration store to a policymaker, whatever, how do we help them talk well to each other? Answer, by designing the meetings in ways that are better than the ones we've done in the last period. So just to kind of run through, this is the Transition Town Movement. They have a kind of model of meeting called the Energy Descent Action Plan, in which citizens from a region meet and in a kind of series of different checklists look at all the things they need to discuss about. So that picture contains business people, policy, farmers, activists, and so on. There are people designing meetings where you physically recreate in a kind of model of the town or the region. This is another transition movement one from, I think this was in London, where they made a kind of scale map of the town and said, okay, what biological features do we want to put into the town to replace the ones that we want to replace? That three-dimensional concept, this is one of the groups associated with Aquilon I just showed you about. I mean, this is all you know about this. The point being that these are meetings that have been designed as explicitly as possible to be a different experience, so that people with their different backgrounds, different expectations, different values, can in any case find common ground to share the experience of being together. Without that, we don't have a hope. With that, we begin to see the possibility of creating and allowing this bioregional alternative to emerge. So this is just a kind of series of badges. You can go on courses called How to Design a Meeting, either from the point of view of the social side of it, the physical side of it, the food, the lighting, the timing. There are skills out there that we as designers or we as planners or whatever can learn so that the meetings are more effective. This is the open space format in the transition movement. And I'm going to stop there because my time is up. If anybody is desperately keen to continue this discussion later on this summer, we're doing a summer school in Sweden, in the archipelago of Stockholm. 3 days to say, what would a bioregional plan for the archipelago be? It's on a nice island called Rinda, and yeah, you can see that on the internet, but I thought I would end on the possibility to continue this discussion. You've been fantastically attentive. It's been a hard story, I know, but thank you very much. And, yeah.